Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this first event that the Center for the Study and Practice of Conflict Resolution here at the University of Malta is organizing under the Abdulaziz Albabtain Chair for Peace that is hosted by the University of Malta and organized by the Center for the Study and Practice of Conflict Resolution. And so this is the first event. We've got some other events planned for the forthcoming year. In April, we are going to be hosting another lecture, another public lecture by Professor Rich Rubinstein, who's got a long history here at the center, as well as the Carter School for Conflict Resolution at George Mason University, with whom we run our dual MA program, and I would like to especially welcome the students to this event. We're also planning a seminar around May, later this year, focused on the Ukrainian war in Europe, again under the auspices of the Albabtain Chair for Peace. So if anyone would like to keep abreast of these news, then I would urge you to like our Facebook page, where we post details about our upcoming events and also any activities that we are engaged in as a center. The lectures that we provide are recorded and made available on YouTube, on the University of Malta's YouTube account, so that they can be followed and disseminated from there. And if you'd like to access them, I would once again urge you to like the University of Malta's account on social media, so you can be updated, stay updated with developments coming from our center. So that said, it's time to move on to the presentation of today, and I am delighted to welcome my colleague and friend, Dr. Mohammad Sartawi, who's also an alumnus of the University of Malta, just like me. And we studied in the same department, the same program of studies, but we hadn't met here at the University of Malta. I met Mohammad at the London School of Economics, where we were both doing our doctoral studies at the time. And we became interested in about the same kinds of issues that had to do with intergroup conflict within national jurisdictions. So it has, his work has a lot to do with diversity, particularly around religious beliefs in a cosmopolitan public sphere. And we were both looking at these issues from different angles and different vantage points. And I found Mohammed's work at the time immensely interesting because his vantage point was that of an insider. And I've invited him here today to talk to us a little bit more about this kind of research, which I hope you will enjoy as much as I have over the years. So without further ado, over to you, Mohammad, and you can start your presentation.
Thank you, Gordon. I'm happy to be here. I've heard a lot of good things from you guys, about you guys from Gordon. I'm going to talk a little bit about research I did a while back, ethnographic research, a lot of participant observation stuff with Muslim communities in London. So I'm going to be sort of going about this in a narrative way, just telling a story. If you'll notice, there's handouts as well that you may have all got. And these are excerpts from my field notes while I was in the fields doing my ethnography. And we'll refer to them just to make some points as the presentation goes along. All right, Gordon said something interesting, which is my perspective as an insider, which was an assumption I also falsely made as a researcher from the beginning. Hence the title of my presentation, View from Outside. So my assumption was when I got there, let me just give some context first. So very shocking news. Suddenly terrorist attacks hit London's public transport, and everything changed for a while. And this was just about when I was starting my PhD. So I was just moving to London to do some sort of research on Muslims, and this happens. This was the July the 7th bombings of the London transport system. 3 bombs on the London Underground and 1 on a public bus detonated within a minute of each other. at around just before 9 o'clock in the morning. It was a Thursday, so the public transport system was very busy. And this attack claimed the lives of 52 people from diverse backgrounds, and it was a very tragic event, of course, and everything changed in London. Heightened security, police presence everywhere, stop and searches all the time, especially people who look like me, which also made my entry into the research very difficult. What it did do, though, was it sort of exposed the side to people, a xenophobic side, a suspicious side. There was a lot of speech in the media, even seminars I attended at the LSE, talking about these Muslims, these terrorists, you know, conflating a lot of concepts and ideas. For example, there was no distinction between terms like Islamism, fundamentalism, jihadism, you know, they sort of all lumped together to mean somebody who is going to carry out a suicide bombing somewhere, you know. And I really wanted to unpack that. Initially, I went into my research looking for terrorism, quote unquote, but then I thought there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding here. Maybe I just need to look at, you know, Joe Blow Muslim or Mohammad Blow Muslim in living in London, trying to get on with life, you know, with everything that's going on. So I started looking around. The three largest mosques in and around the central London area are the Central London or Regents Park Mosque, the North London or Finsbury Park Mosque, and the East London Mosque. And I started just attending these mosques during different prayer times, particularly in the middle of the day, so noon, afternoon, and evening, when there was likely to be more people attending. I'd go about half an hour before prayers start and stay for half an hour to an hour after the end and just kind of observe and look around. And that was initially for 2 weeks. Doing some research at the time, Regents Park Mosque, which is located in Regents Park. I don't know if any of you have been to London, but it's my favorite park in London. It's a beautiful park, and this mosque is literally in the middle of the park. It was completed in 1977, funded by the Saudi government. WikiLeaks revealed in the leaks that 35 Guantanamo Bay detainees had passed through both Regents Park Mosque and another mosque that I was also visiting. And the mosque has a cultural center, it has a cafe, it has a restaurant. It was more like an organization than a mosque. So there was an administration, there was a sort of chairperson with a secretary, right? And the feeling I got of this mosque that it was that people there generally subscribe to a very Saudi type of Islam, a Wahhabist type of Islam, right? And I'm going to explain a little bit more about that later as well. Then there was the Finsbury Park Mosque in North London. This mosque was infamous when I got there. It opened in 1988. Initially, it opened by the local community, mostly Bangladeshis, Bengalis. They got together, they needed a place to pray. They found a little space. They started using it as a prayer space. And after a while, it sort of developed. Then it was funded by Saudi money as well. And it opened in 1994 as a 5-story mosque, right? The difference between this mosque and the other mosque was the other mosque continued to be funded by Saudi. This one sort of was taken over by the local community over time, and they sort of provided the funds to maintain it. The special thing about this mosque was that it was taken over by a very controversial figure, Abu Hamza al-Masri. He became the Imam of the mosque. Initially, he was appointed as a trustee by the board of trustees, and then he sort of went radical, apparently after a visit to Malta, because he was friends with Jean Ajus. You don't know Jean Ajus? They called him the king of sleaze in London. So initially this guy, the Maltese guy, had a bunch of strip joints in central London, and Abu Hamza was actually working as a bouncer for these strip clubs. And then something happened in '99, and he sort of became, yeah. Well, he was in the Maltese media, you know, in the '90s. Anyway, so the mosque became very radicalized. a lot of people that were connected to either failed terrorist plots or actual terrorist attacks had worshipped at this mosque and spent time at this mosque. This man was clearly preaching jihadism, and they even held an event to celebrate September the 11th attacks in the US, blatantly, you know. So eventually, the mosque was raided in 2003, a bunch of arrests, it was shut down. And slowly, until 2005, it reopened. The board of trustees changed, and they appointed a more moderate sort of imam. This mosque is mostly attended by North Africans. This area, Finsbury Park, lots of Algerians, lots of Arabs, and interestingly, the Algerians moved there to escape persecution from Algeria towards the Muslims. They had a very bloody civil war for 10 years. An Islamic sort of political party was elected to power. There was a rebellion by the anti-Islamists, and then there was a war for a while. So a lot of the people who wanted to be, you know, Muslim, with outward appearance of a Muslim, adhering to practices as a Muslim, sort of got out of Algeria and moved to this area in London. The East London Mosque. This is in a part of London that's completely South Asian, Bangladeshi, Indian. I don't know if any of you who have been to London have been to Brick Lane in that area. This mosque was completed in '85. It expanded in 2004. The funds were raised by the local community with help from countries like Saudi, Kuwait, and Bahrain. But it's a mosque of the local community. I mean, it's by the people, for the people. It's huge. It's got ballrooms, a seminar suite, nursery, classrooms, a fitness center. There's an Islamic cultural center. There's a law advisory office. It's enormous. Radio station even. They have retail units. They rent out some spaces for shops. It's one of the largest mosques in Europe. It can hold up to 7,000 worshippers. And it's also the first mosque in the UK allowed to broadcast the call to prayer over loudspeakers. So it's, you know, a big part of the landscape of central London. All right, so here's me trying to become a participant observer. It was tricky. At the time, everybody was suspicious of anyone who was trying to come to the mosque and say, hey, I want to look around and see what you guys are doing here. So that was an issue. Another issue was I didn't know exactly how to go about it. And there was the problem of informed consent. So I couldn't lie to people and say that I was there for anything other than basically observing them and taking notes on them. So I approached the administration of the mosques. I went to the director of the Regents Park Mosque. It was very difficult to get any responses from him. Finally, his secretary took pity on me because I was going there so often and trying to get in touch with the guy that she said, come at this time tomorrow and I'll sneak you into his office and you can talk to him. And I did, and it turns out that his family and my grandmother's family are distantly related and some kind of connection there because he's from Saudi and I'm from Kuwait, which are very, you know, close cultures. So he sorted me out. I got a sweet deal here. So I became the personal assistant to the imams. The imams would get a lot of visits and calls from people trying to get Islamic interpretations of situations. For example, you know, my mother's sick and I have to work somewhere close to her in case she needs me, but the only job I could find in the neighborhood is at a bar, you know, and that's obviously haram. You know, you can't sell alcohol in a bar. So he'll come to the imam and say, is this okay? Can I do this? I have to, I don't know what to do, you know, or taking insulin injections in Ramadan or any kind of injection, you know, does that count as breaking a fast because you're ingesting something into your body or not? So constantly people were calling or coming to seek advice from the imams. I had a desk and a computer and people would come in and I'd be the filter because the imam was inundated. So he said, you're a godsend, just sit here and, you know, the people that you can answer quickly, just answer them quickly and send them off. And the people who have more problematic issues, then send them in to me. So it was really easy for me I would always introduce myself in the beginning and say, I'm a researcher here. I'm taking notes on, you know, the people who visit the imam. So that kind of counts as informed consent. And then I would, because I had a computer in front of me, I could actually take notes while I was in the participant observation situation. The East London Mosque was probably the trickiest to get access to. I mean, I had to struggle and find contacts and create networks. This one took me over a year to get access to. These people are completely closed off. They have their own community. They're pretty self-sufficient, but eventually I managed to get a job there. As for the Finsbury Park Mosque, this was the least formal mosque. So I basically just went to the mosque, went up the stairs, and went to see the trustee who was in charge of the mosque. We had a conversation. He was also very suspicious. Recently, there had been some kind of expose following the 2005 bombing. So this was now 2006, trying to show that the mosque was still radicalized and, they hadn't really been cleaned the way that the media assumed. So he was really suspicious of what I was doing there, but eventually I also got a job there. So in Regents Park, I was personal assistant to the Imam. At the Finsbury Park Mosque, I was working with kitchen staff on Mondays and Wednesdays, but I went almost every day. But my allotted times were Mondays and Wednesdays. And so we'd sit there from 2:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. during Ramadan and prepare these huge meals for hundreds of people. Literally, I mean, the pot was large enough that I could sit in it and close the lid, So we'd be there with these big stir sticks, stirring chicken and making rice and feeding people all evening. At the East London Mosque, I got a job at digital archiving. So because the mosque was part and parcel of the history of the area, they had a lot of documents, images, pictures that were paper-based, and they wanted to change all that into a digital archive. So a lot of scanning of documents and, creating files and stuff like that. But at least I was always at the mosque around the people who worked and worshipped there. And then on Fridays, I'd alternate between mosques and attend Friday prayer just to be there when it was the most attended by people. When I took my notes, I generally divided them as follows. I had passive observations. So this was just me watching and making notes, how people were interacting with each other, how the spaces were occupied, what people were doing. And then I had the notes of my interactions, things that were happening with me in the field. Like I said, usually I would write these later, but except in one of the mosques, I had the computer in front of me so I could do it in, real time. And then I always had these reflections, a big part of doing research in the qualitative side, I'm sure is reflexivity. So you need to kind of be mindful of your own presence and how that's influencing your research and the field and your own assumptions and stuff like that. So when I was analyzing, I divided my notes like I showed you, and then I'd revisit these notes and write memos and commentaries, and slowly themes kind of emerged and I got some sort of analysis out of it all. At the same time, I started to think about these concepts in terms like fundamentalism, Islamism, Jihadism, radicalism, extremism. What did they all mean? Why were they being used so unproblematically by the media, lumped together? And it was at the heart of a lot of misunderstanding of Muslims and the Muslim community. So I went to look for books that carried Islamic thought that was assumed to feed into any or all of those things, right? So I picked these three books. The first one was Kitab al-Tawheed by Ibn Abdul Wahhab. The second one, Let Us Be Muslims by Abu al-Ala Maududi. And the third one was called Milestones by Sayyid Qutb. I'll quickly give a brief summary of these books, right? So Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. I don't know if you've heard of Wahhabism. So what is Wahhabism? What is Wahhabi? It's, Wahhabists don't even like to be called that. They don't associate them. They just think of themselves as Salafists, Salaf. And Salafist means somebody who wants to practice Islam the way it was practiced by the first adherents to Islam. So they want to go back to that way of practice and keep doing it now, all right? Muhammad Abdul Wahhab emerged at a time when the Ottoman Empire had its hold on most of the Middle East region. You'll notice there's a little space around here. Let me see if I can get a laser pointer out. Yeah, so notice all these areas are occupied by the Ottoman Empire, except this little white kind of empty space here in the middle, yeah? And that's the center of Saudi Arabia. And the reason for that is because it was very resource poor at the time. They didn't know that oil existed. And it was full of a bunch of warring crazy tribes, warring crazy tribesmen, Bedouins in the desert, just vying for little plots of sand, you know? So the Ottomans thought, you know what, we can administer the region around it and we don't need to really get ourselves involved in whatever's going on there. So this created a power vacuum. At the same time, Islam was being practiced in a way that was affected a lot by the Ottoman version of Islam. And they kind of have this saint worship or reverence. They visit shrines. They believe in a lot of superstitious stuff, talismans, curses. And a lot of people were kind of feeling that that wasn't really a proper way to practice Islam. So Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab started to try to return Islam to the idea of the oneness of God. So the idea of the oneness of God, or Tawheed, means that God is above everything. So nothing should concern you as long as God is in charge, you know? So you shouldn't be superstitious because, you know, there's God and God will kind of carry things through in the end. You shouldn't worry about how much money you're making or being broke or stuff like that, because God's there and God's gonna somehow drive things in a certain way. That's, you know, a kind of fatalistic idea of God as well. And so he started to destroy anything that kind of competed with God in that respect. So he destroyed a lot of the shrines. He went out and spoke against this superstitious stuff, using talismans, all the practices that were influenced by Ottoman Islam. And a lot of people found that to be, you know, very encouraging. They actually liked it. At the same time, Abdulaziz bin Saud, who's the founder of modern Saudi Arabia, thought that this was a great ally to spread his power across the region. So they allied together. He had a spiritual leader now, and Abdul Wahhab had the military might to spread this version of Islam across Saudi Arabia. And that's how Wahhabism, as we call it, came to be. And then, of course, because Saudi has a lot of money now, it's exported to all parts of the world. If Saudi wants to fund any Muslim centers, mosques, help any Muslim communities out, then this Wahhabism or this sort of ideology is transported there, right? Okay, so this Wahhabi thought is usually vilified. You know, this is what fundamentalist thought is. But let's see what fundamentalism in essence really means here. So let's look at Abdul Wahhab's problem. The problem was that he saw that Islam was being reinvented. Old customs and habits were coming back. So, I mean, those regions of the world always had this belief in spiritual world and demons and curses and stuff like that. And so all these beliefs just came back under the guise of Islam. And then he had a problem with the fact that Muslims weren't unified, right? So what did he want to do? He wanted to implement and practice Sharia law as practiced by the Salaf, the first followers of Islam. However, he wanted to do this from the bottom up. So change hearts and minds first, and then the system itself will change eventually. What was his method? He would literally, his book was just excerpts from either the Quran or the Prophet's teachings, and straight up exegesis, just interpretation of that, you know, in as much as he could. And that was it. So these are the principles based on this part of the Quran or this part of the Prophet's teachings, and that's how the book went from beginning to end. So in a sense, it was rested on the fundamentals of Islam, so it is fundamentalism, but why does fundamentalism necessarily need to be a bad thing? You know, why does it have a negative connotation? So his concerns were, like I said, people weren't distinguishing between scripture and its interpretation by these people who are practicing weird, or to him, what was weird practices related to Islam. He encouraged that people go back to the scripture, try to understand it. This is the principle of ijtihad, not jihad. So try to make sense of it yourself. Try to understand and interpret based on certain format or rules or methodology what the message is, and condemn taqleed. Taqleed is blind, what's the word? Blind imitation, right? The main point is that Abdul Wahhab saw that we should enter in dialogue with anybody who doesn't understand this message, is opposed to this message. So his first step was always dialogue and advise people who, and he said that Muslims are always Muslims as long as they say they're Muslims. Sinners are to be verbally instructed or advised, but we cannot call somebody who claims to be a Muslim a non-Muslim, right? And this is a key point because this is where things start to change with the other Islamic forms of Islamic thought. What about jihad? Abdul Wahhab, despite the fact that he was involved with Al Saud and their attempts to take over Saudi Arabia, he did not believe in jihad. And I'm going to explain why. He said that verbal instruction or advice is the way forward. He even had a book called Kitab al-Jihad, and it was not intended as a manifesto of action. It was just there to make people understand what jihad is, and I'm going to explain that in a bit as well. So jihad is only permissible as a defensive activity and not an offensive activity. And he was very clear about the point that there should be no compulsion in Islam. So you can't force people to be a way that they don't want to be. All right, so let's look at jihad in Islam based on Abdul Wahhab's thought. So this goes back to one of Abdul Wahhab's influences, Ibn al-Qayyim, and he has this typology of jihad. And I just wanted to highlight when jihad actually means any form of violence, right? So when it comes to jihad, the world is divided into three different arenas, okay? So you have Darul Islam, which is the home of Islam. Jihad is not permitted in the home of Islam. Anywhere where Islam is practiced by the majority of the people and Islam is the main religion, jihad is not permitted in these places, all right? Then you have Darul Sulh, and these are places where Muslim communities live and they have an accord with the dominant majority so that they can practice freely and live there as Muslims. And again, jihad is also not permitted in these places, okay? The only time that jihad is permitted is in Darul Harb, land of war, okay? And the land of war is where Muslims are clearly being persecuted, where they're not allowed to practice. They're being tortured, they're being arrested, you know? And then jihad is only permitted as an act of defense, okay? It's not even permitted, it's prescribed. So somebody needs to pick up arms against these people, right? So as you see here, jihad means struggle. You struggle with yourself to know truth, to change yourself. You struggle with temptation. You struggle with all these different kinds of things. When you're faced with persecution, you struggle with your heart, you struggle with your tongue, you struggle with your possessions. The last option is to struggle with the self, or which means to be physical. And this was Abdul Wahhab's thought on jihad. All right. Then we move to Abu al-Ala Maududi, let us be Muslims. It's very important to contextualize these Islamic thinkers because you'll understand how this thought functions or what the purpose of this type of Islamic thought is. Maududi was gaining prominence in India just before partition. So Britain was losing its grip on India and it was approaching its partition. And Maududi was against India's partition. He said that we need to move towards the unification of Muslims, and if we partition India, then we're also partitioning the Muslim community. So when Pakistan was established, Maududi was at the forefront, and he had a big hand in the writing of the Constitution of Pakistan as well. Okay, so clearly a very political context now for Maududi. You'll see the relation between Maududi and Abdul Wahhab in the following. So the problem that he was facing was the deterioration of the state of Muslims and the powerlessness of the Muslim community or the Ummah. And he also blamed all these problems on misunderstandings of what Islam actually is. So a lot in common with Abdul Wahhab there. His aim was the establishment of an Islamic state ruled by Sharia law. And this time, instead of Abdul Wahhab wanting it from bottom to top, hearts and minds, and then the system, this guy wanted to change the system first, right? And so they created a political party, Jama'ati Islami, and they started to instruct the masses in the political arena, right? Try to gain support, mass, a following, and through political means, gain influence. So this is what Islamism is. Now, if you look at the definition of Islamism, then it's a political form of Islam, right? But then when you hear the word Islamism, you think, oh my God, somebody's going to blow something up, right? So the points of connection with Abdul Wahhab, he used Tawheed as well, the oneness of God, that God should be everything. And we should establish the dominion of God over man rather than man over man. So we need to free people from the dominion of other men so that they can truly be free and only be ruled by God. Again, the Quran and the Sunnah, or the Prophet's teachings and the Quran, were the only way to know the right way to be. He also rejected blind imitation. He accepted all schools of Islamic jurisprudence. Remember, his aim here was always unification. So how do we bring all the Muslims together? And he avoided the practice of takfir, or exclusion. So takfir, when you say somebody is a kafir, when you look at a Muslim and you say you're a kafir, you're basically excluding them from Islam. You're saying you're not part of our community. And this is something that Maududi didn't like. Now, how does he differ from Abdul Wahhab? He had a different tone. Abdul Wahhab had a very advisory kind of tone. This is the way you should do things, you know. This guy was more instructive. He had a more authoritarian voice in his writing. He also divided Muslims, although he was working towards the unification of Muslims. He had a typology of Muslims. He said you can be a full Muslim where everything in your life is devotion to God, or you can be a partial Muslim where you might believe in Islam, but then you live your life a different way, right? And this is actually a step towards exclusion, because this was picked up later by other thinkers. A problem with Maududi is that he sometimes interprets things in a decontextualized manner. With Abdul Wahhab, whenever he'd interpret anything from the Prophet's teachings on the Quran, he'd say, because back in the day, that's what the conditions of life were, so it makes sense that this is what they were saying we should do, you know? The problem with Maududi was that he would decontextualize some of these things and kind of use them to serve his own purposes. He also acknowledged that there's no compulsion in Islam, but he saw that, you know, the only way of realizing Islam will be eventually the use of force. And he treated Islam as, Jihad as the sixth pillar in Islam. So in Islam, we have 5 pillars. We have the prayer, we have the fasting of Ramadan, we have the Hajj, we have what we give zakat, so almsgiving, and the Hajj, the pilgrimage, right? He said Jihad is the 6th pillar of Islam, and everyone needs to involve themselves in some sort of jihad as a complete practice of Islam. One other thing that Maududi did that gets picked up later was he started to speak of the age of ignorance, or Jahiliyyah. So Jahiliyyah is what Islam refers to the time before Islam. Before Islam, the world was in Jahiliyyah, or the age of ignorance. After Islam, enlightenment came. And Maududi started to talk about some parts of the world being back in this age of ignorance, right? Because they've forgotten God and they've strayed away from his path, and, you know, so they're going back to these forms of ignorance before. All right, milestones by Sayyid Qutb. Now, Sayyid Qutb is considered to be the godfather of jihadism, right? So this is the guy that sort of started a full and complete ideology of jihad. All right. Again, the problems are very similar, and you can refer to in your handouts I have some excerpts from this book. Whenever you see between brackets like here, C12 and 13, then the last part of the handout will have some excerpts that kind of carry these points home. So the problem was the deterioration of the state of Muslims, Islam's being contaminated, very similar problems. His aim was to purge Islam of this contamination and to bring power to the law of God through the establishment of a global Islamic state. Okay? Let's give you some context about Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb, at the time that he started writing, he was actually in prison for a failed attempt to assassinate the president of Egypt at the time. Okay? Who was the president of Egypt at the time? Jamal Abdel Nasser. Jamal Abdel Nasser, of course, was a revolutionary in the Arab world. He introduced the ideas of pan-Arabism and started the political movement that was pan-Arab. He went up against the Brits. He kicked out the puppet Ottoman monarchy in Egypt, and they established power at the time. And initially, because Qutb was part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood was seen as a very positive grassroots movement that helped the poor and spread education and things like that, he would consult a lot with Qutb. Abdel Nasser would consult with Qutb. He would visit him in his home. He'd take his ideas and try to implement them. But soon Qutb started to realize that Abdel Nasser wasn't going in the direction of a kind of Islamic political movement. He was going in the direction of a more secular, socialist, pan-Arab political movement. And Qutb got the idea that Abdel Nasser was basically deceiving him, that he was just putting on a ruse. And he got really frustrated with that. And they tried to assassinate Abdel Nasser. And then the Egyptian government cracked down hard on the Muslim Brotherhood, arrested a bunch of people. There are allegations of torture towards Qutb and his closest followers. And so he was in prison for 10 years, and that's when he did most of his writing. So this kind of gives you an idea of the state of mind of this Islamic thinker at the time that he started to publish his thoughts and work, right? So how is this connected to, so we went from fundamentalism to Islamism, and now we're going to jihadism. So how is this connected to Islamism and fundamentalism? Again, the Quran and Sunnah should be the only way, and the focus was on the concept of Tawheed, or the oneness of God. This was always the driving force behind all these three thinkers. Again, he said that the proper way to practice Islam was the way of the Salaf. And he was concerned with ridding Islam of innovation. And he talked about the proper application of ijtihad, or going back to the scriptures and trying to make sense of them on your own, although he never did any of that in his work. What did Qutb do? He rejected all other forms of Islamic interpretation. He said, these other Muslims who interpret Islam in this soft, delicate, peaceful, democratic way are deluded. They don't know what they're talking about. This is how Islam should be. I'm going to tell you. He engages in takfir, exclusion. He excludes all other forms of Islam or Muslims. If they don't do what I'm saying they should do, then they're basically not Muslims. They're basically kafirs. They're outside the realm of Islam. He started to talk about Islam being public in nature. It's not something that you believe in your heart. It's not a philosophy that you hold that guides your everyday action. No, it needs to be implemented and practiced on a state level everywhere. For him, Islamic society or the Ummah is the Islamic state. You can't have an Islamic community. You need to have a global Islamic state. And then he extends this concept of ignorance, or the age of ignorance, to the entire world. So Maududi talked about Jahiliyyah, or the age of ignorance, and he said there are these pockets in the world where people have strayed away from the path of God. And Qutb said the whole world is in Jahiliyyah, in ignorance, which needs to be, of course, educated by Islam. He rejects any form of deliberation with non-Muslims. He said we should have no relationships with them. We should have no discussions with them. He favors confrontation and force. We'll bring them to heel through force and violence. And he justifies jihad as more than just defensive. He said, even in times of peace, you should engage in jihad to establish the dominion of God over man. All right, so now we have a clear understanding of what fundamentalism is, what Islamism is, and what jihadism is, right? And those sort of aspects of Islamic thought I would see throughout my ethnography in different forms with different communities and community members. My main findings in my ethnography were that people generally, Muslims generally in London, felt that there was quite some tension between them wanting to be Muslim and living in the UK. So if you look at excerpt 10, for example, I mean, these guys are talking about a very sort of traditional Arab Muslim approach to husband and wife, and, you know, trying to fit that into a British context. Some would choose to leave their wives back in their countries of origin because they think that, oh, if I bring my wife here, she's going to be contaminated by all these ideas and beliefs, so I'm just going to leave her back there. And then another would say, no, I'd rather have her with me because I don't know what she'll be doing there if I leave her there. And then these people would kind of have an argument about stuff like that. So, you know, people were in their own way trying to make sense of how to be a Muslim the proper way and at the same time live in the UK. There was this constant feeling of belief clash with the UK or the way life is lived in the UK. There were difficulties to everyday life as a Muslim. So there was a guy, for example, if you look at excerpt 5, his business was failing. He had some sort of restaurant or cafe or something, and all the other restaurants and cafes in the area were serving alcohol, and he wasn't because he was Muslim. And he came to the imam to ask if it would be okay for him to get an alcohol license, because otherwise his business would fail and it would go under. Also, what I found was that some Muslim communities were almost closed off from the rest of the UK. I mean, they even had their own council for civil affairs, the Islamic Sharia Council. So if I wanted to solve a marital dispute, or you know, in Islam, women can't get a divorce. Men are the ones who divorce the women, but under certain conditions, women can ask for a divorce. They need to do that. And of course, in the UK, it's so simple. If a woman wants to divorce her husband, then she just needs to go to court and get a divorce, you know, and things work out. But they wanted to do it through the Sharia Council so that it's Islamic, you know, the same with marriage, the same with everything else. So this shows you that even with regards to civil matters, civil life, civil law, that they prefer to do it within their community rather than use the UK system of law. All right, what I found really useful in understanding the field and the data was social identity theory. I'm a social psychologist, so I'm going to try to push that on you. Are you guys familiar with any social psychology or social identity theory? Have you come across any of this? All right. So it's based on two central concepts in psychology. First of all, categorization. So in order for us to simplify the influx of stimuli in the world, we need to categorize it, right? To summarize it somehow, so it's much easier to deal with, yeah? And we do that with people. So we try to create categories for people, whether it's based on nationality, sex, whatever it is, you know? And then it's a lot easier for us to deal with novel stimuli, so that every time I encounter a new person, I don't have to sit there and explore every facet of this person and gain an entirely new understanding of this human being. No, I just put them in a category. That category already has a description of traits of whatever, and, you know, I can deal a lot easier with that stimulus. So we categorize people. And the main categorization that we do with people is that we have the category of us and the category of them, right? So this is my group and my people, and these are other groups and other people, us and them. Another main concept in social psychology is social comparison. So in order for me to gauge anything to do with myself, I look at other people and compare, right? So let's say you have certain symptoms, right? And you go to the doctor. And the doctor does some tests and then tells you that they've diagnosed you with some weird condition that you've never even heard of with a really scary name, right? You're going to get worried, right? You're going to tell the doctor, you know, what is this? What do I do? And the doctor might say, you know, there's a simple procedure. We'll just do it. It's going to be a little bit uncomfortable for a while, but you'll be fine. The first thing you do when you leave is you try to find somebody else who's been told the same thing by a doctor, right? You want to figure out where you stand with this thing, you know? So you want to compare yourself to somebody who's been through it. You know, you want to talk to somebody, be like, what was it like? What do I do? And so we do this a lot to gauge or assess different things about ourselves. And we do this also on a social level, on a group level. So in order for me to know how happy I am with my group membership, then I'll compare my group with other groups and want to come out on top, right? So I feel good about my group membership. So social identity theory rests on this premise that we always need to establish a positive social identity that's also distinct. We all love the groups we belong to. We're very proud of our memberships in certain groups, whether that's family, whether that's veganism, I don't know, you know, and we want to feel that this group is a good group to belong to, but also that it's distinct in its identity. And that's linked to our self-esteem. And of course, self-esteem is one of the main motivators for human behavior to maintain a positive self-esteem. All right, so what do groups do when they feel threatened? I've established through the field notes that people felt that their identities were threatened, either because they couldn't be Muslim or because people didn't like Muslims. So what do? According to social identity theory, we want a positive and distinct social identity. If we do have it, then we're going to try to maintain it. We're going to try to hold on to it, and we're going to try to extend our superiority over other groups. What if it's not adequate, as was the case with the Muslim community here? Then we're going to try to seek some sort of change. We want to establish a positive identity. What do? Well, that depends. My group and the other group, if my group is threatened and I feel inferior, then the other group is necessarily the superior one, right? Okay, this status difference between my group and the other group, is it stable? Is there any chance of it changing or not, in my mind? And is it legitimate? Do they deserve to be the superior group? Does my group deserve to be the inferior group? So these two concepts of stability and legitimacy, they decide how I'm going to move towards seeking change and establishing a positive social identity, okay? If I view the status differences between groups as stable and legitimate, they're not going to change anytime soon, then I'm going to try, if I can, to exit my group and join the superior group on an individual basis, right? That's why a lot of people get absorbed and basically become one with the dominant majority. So if you look at, I have an excerpt here, I think somewhere. Which one was it? Oh, number 6. So this is a Muslim man, an Arab Muslim. He was married to a Portuguese woman, and his wife wanted their children to have first communion, right? And I mean, looking at this guy and speaking to this guy, he didn't sound Arab at all. His Arabic was broken when he tried to speak Arabic. He dressed like, you know, a British person. So, you know, he obviously wasn't your stereotypical member of the Muslim community that I was encountering every day. But when it came to this, he sort of felt like he should consult with the imam. So the wife wanted the children to have first communion. He wanted to know if that was okay, but he didn't want to speak to the imam directly. He wanted to speak to me because I guess he sort of knew what the imam would say, and he wanted a kind of opinion of a person who was more like him in a sense that, you know, lives in the West and kind of, you know, is trying to get by in the West and stuff. So he wanted, you know, on a brother to brother level, would you do it if it were you? You know what I mean? That kind of thing. So this guy was obviously trying to exit the inferior group and become part of the higher social status group. Another thing you can do is you compare yourself to other people in your own group to try and come out on top, right? So you say to yourself, yes, but I'm not like them, these losers, you know, I'm doing all this stuff that makes me better than them. So you kind of try to establish a positive identity that way. Now, if you perceive that the status differences between your inferior group and the superior group are unstable or illegitimate, and usually those affect each other, right? So if I think that these people don't deserve to be the higher status group, then I'm gonna think that it's gonna change at some point, you know? Then things get interesting, okay? And this is where the communities all differ. So ideology works to challenge the stability of intergroup status differences and the legitimacy of intergroup status differences. So among the three communities that I had in my study, the first one, the Wahhabist Salafist community, trying to be self-sufficient and closed off from the rest of the wider community, to them, the status differences between groups seemed stable and legitimate. There was no way that that was going to change, you know? Non-Muslims are the dominant group in the UK, and Muslims are the inferior group in the UK, right? So what they prefer to do is they get creative. They change the criteria for comparison with the other group. Yes, they might be the higher status group, but we have our Islam, but we're going to be saved by God. But you know what I mean? So they change the dimensions of intergroup comparison, and that way they achieve a positive social identity, right? The second group, the Islamist group in the East London Mosque, right? Those people were definitely influenced by Maududi's thoughts. They were political Islamists through and through, but they were the most integrated of the three groups that I studied. These guys were organized, they worked hard, they went to university, they got degrees, they tried to get into the system and make it through the system. And they've had a whole bunch of MPs now from that community in the UK, members of parliament. They've had mayors of different districts of London. So it's working out for them. So for them to establish Islam in the state, then you're going to have to work through the system politically, right? So Islamism, in this sense, is really the most integrative of the three forms of thought that we discussed. The third way is to directly challenge the outgroup, right? So that's when we're starting to talk about jihad, okay? Now, I didn't find any of that in my Muslim communities, very little of it, in fact. The only, I think I have one quote, which is quote 9. And I mean, this guy, Yunus, was really pro Abu Hamza. Now, remember, Abu Hamza was the radical imam who was preaching at the Finsbury Park Mosque. And this is at the Finsbury Park Mosque that I encountered this guy. Also, another thing, if you look at quote 11, so one of the things that Qutb, the Muslim Brotherhood, the jihadist thinker, did was to say that we shouldn't let any form of Western knowledge contaminate our minds, because that comes from ignorance, jahiliyyah. And so it's necessarily going to contaminate our Islam if we let that in. So culture, philosophy, arts, the humanities, all that stuff, we can't study any of that stuff. It's just going to corrupt our minds, right? And interestingly, this was echoed by another person at the Finsbury Park Mosque. If you look at excerpt 11, right. So, I mean, this was very impactful for me to realize what an outsider I was, in a sense, how I approached these communities with a set of assumptions that were completely broken down after my research, finding that the most integrative form of Islamic thought is actually political Islam for Muslims in the UK, and stuff like that. But I wanted to end this with something that is more relevant to conflict resolution, since we're here at the Center for Conflict Resolution. What I had gone through was something called contact in social psychology, or the contact hypothesis. I don't know if you guys have come across that or not, but this is a way forward to solve intergroup problems, right? So there are conditions for this contact. Basically, the main principle is that the more we come into contact with people from out groups that we might have misunderstandings of, the less we are prejudiced, right? But this contact has to occur under certain conditions. First of all, generally, the social norms should favor intergroup acceptance, right? The situation should be favoring that everybody gets along. If you take apartheid, for example, in South Africa, for a long time, these two groups were in contact, but that wasn't going anywhere, right? When the ANC actually became a legitimate political party in power, and the norms became fostering of this kind of, or norms of getting along across races, then that situation started to change very fast. The situation needs to promote intimate contact between members of both groups. So it's not enough to just kind of meet and talk for a little bit, but you actually need to have an opportunity to become acquainted on a personal level. The contact situation needs to promote equal status interactions, right? Now, this is difficult. It's kind of tricky because if I'm a member of the higher status group, then what interest do I have in kind of mixing with the inferior people? And I'm going to look at the situation as one where I have more status, which is challenging. And the contact situation needs to provide opportunities for cooperative interdependence. So we need to work together, cooperate in a way where we both have something that we need to get done by the other person. All right. And this was my experience with my ethnography. I was basically there as an equal status member in intimate contact with these people and working with them on a daily basis. And, you know, it really changed my view on a lot of things being in that situation. All right, so take home points. The view from outside is always oversimplified. If contact is done under the right conditions, then what we hope will happen is that instead of using group level information to form impressions of other people, like all Muslims are backward and weird and stuff like that, I start to use more personal level characteristics as information on the person, you know? So group level cues become less significant for forming impressions than personal characteristics. And effective contact is probably one of the better pathways to understanding of and dialogue with the other. Thank you.